without further ado, I want to introduce our two leaders from today. We don't have a really good term for this yet. I guess we're calling you guys leaders. Um, and both of them are from the EcoHealth Alliance, located in New York. We have Kevin Olival, who's Vice President for Research. He's an ecologist and evolutionary biologist who researches emerging infectious diseases, particularly those related to bats. And we have Hongying Li, who's the China Programs Coordinator, expert in conservation and public health, with particular interest in the health implications of the wildlife trade. And they're going to give a sort of brief presentation without slides, I think, just, talking, sharing their perspectives from the two papers and anything else. And then, we'll let the discussion unfold. So welcome. Thank you guys very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Meredith. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm Kevin Olival. Perfect. I was having some bandwidth issues, I think, because everyone in the world is online right now. It's a little tricky. But, this is great. I have a room full of people, and so thank you all for joining. It looks like a great group. I just scrolled through the list. I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes. And this is sort of the old school. I feel like Darwin or Alfred Wallace, where, before PowerPoint, you got to just get up and present a paper, which is kind of nice. I'll give a 10-minute thing, and then Hongying can go ahead and go into more detail about one of the papers that we sent around. I think hopefully people had a chance to look at those papers. If not a big deal. I think we can have a general discussion around COVID-19 and emergence of viruses like SARS coronavirus 2. And I wanted to just start by giving people an overview of EcoHealth Alliance and the type of work that we do if you're not familiar with our organization. So we're a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in New York. Our offices are in Manhattan, although, of course, we've all been working remotely for about a month or several weeks now. Our work, while we're based in the US, is all over the world. And so we work on the ground with in-country scientists and partners in probably about 20 countries around the world. It's a very interesting place to work from my perspective because it's really multidisciplinary. And so I come from more an ecological background, but we have a lot of MPH, Masters of Public Health professionals working with us, veterinarians, disease modelers, mathematicians, programmers, economists. We're a fairly small shop, but we have a very diverse kind of group of perspectives. And so thinking about this overall theme of One Health, I think EcoHealth is nice because really we have a lot of the One Health sectors sort of under one roof, and typically we're in the same office most of the time. And then we have this great relationship with in-country scientists around the world, including in China, that you'll hear more about from Hongying, that are actually on the ground, catching animals, working in labs, and helping shape policy at a national level in terms of working with ministries of health, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Agriculture, to take some of the knowledge base that we're building through our research and begin to implement changes wherever possible to sort of put in some pandemic prevention or some at least One Health policies in those countries. And so we do also help support that framework, this One Health framework at a national level where we can. And then at an international level, we have colleagues like some of you may know Dr. Billy Karish, Catherine Machalaba, and others who really lead some of our global policy work, including working with WHO and OIE and FAO and colleagues that are leading some of the intergovernmental organization work on One Health. So that's kind of an overview of what we do and how we do it. Now I'll give you kind of a brief overview to one of the two papers that we sent around, which the title is A Strategy to Prevent Future Epidemics, similar to the 2019 nCoV outbreak. Peter Daszak, who's the president of EcoHealth Alliance, is the first author, and myself and Hongying co-authored this, basically a thought piece with him. And so I wanted to frame this paper first, and then Hongying can talk in more detail about the second paper, which is looking specifically at behavioral risk for disease emergence in China, which, you know, I think that work is fascinating in that basically we found evidence that bat SARS-related coronaviruses were spilling over into the human population, you know, at least 6 months or a year before the current outbreak. And so, you know, the early warning signals were there. I think one part of the discussion is, you know, what can we do better about once we have some of that information to sort of stop this and these events from happening again. So that's what this paper is with Peter is all about. And so we kind of broke it into 3 major components that we saw as like more concrete steps forward into building a better pandemic prevention program in light of this new emergence. And I should note that we wrote this paper before it was even named COVID-19, the disease, and before the virus was named SARS coronavirus 2, hence the title. And so early on, you know, in January when we put this together, you know, cases were basically still constricted to China. I think there might have been a few traveling cases that have spilled out of China, but pretty early where we had not yet been dealing with the pandemic we are dealing with now. But we did see it as a kind of sort of reshape the way that we and so if you didn't have a chance to see the papers, I think Meredith can send them on again. But the first piece is, you know, we talked about surveillance for wildlife, surveillance for pathogens at the wildlife interface, right? So a lot of what we think about is sort of left of boom, right? If you look at an epidemic curve, how do you get further to the axis of that curve at the early case when cases are first, even further ahead of the curve before human infection starts, right? And some people say this is impossible. We can't really prevent pandemics before starting population, and make sure there are measures we can put into place to mitigate against that initial spillover event, and at least put in some infrastructure, some global health infrastructure to catch those initial human cases when they do first emerge before they start spreading person to person. And so why does, you know, viral discovery in wildlife, why is that important? And, you know, it's been criticized in some circles, you know, programs like the Global Virome Project, which is an initiative that we're helping to build. Our USAID Predict project, I think was a very successful and innovative example of how to think more proactively about disease emergence. So this was a 10-year program that we just actually have an extension now to actually do some more work on COVID-19 for the next 6 months. But the USA Predict project was actually working in 30 countries around the world and looking in viral discovery in wildlife, building not only the sort of on the ground capacity to find viruses at that human animal interface, where those areas are riskiest in terms of the interface, but also then laboratory capacity to detect across a viral family new pathogens, right? To not just have assays for known things, but to be able to detect previously unknown viruses, at least that are related to things that we know. So it was both lab and field capacity strengthening. And there was also a lot of human behavioral research that was part of that project. And Hongying will speak more to that in terms of interviewing people, getting on the ground and collecting what are the risk factors, what are the cultural practices around that human animal interface. And then that will give information on how can we then develop interventions after we collect some basic information. But on the wildlife viral diversity side, I mean, I think of this as just, this is the baseline of information that we need in order to understand what is the underlying risk. And, you know, you can think of risk in terms of there's the hazard, right? Or like the sort of blanket underlying risk that might be out there. How many cars are on the road? How many viruses are out there circulating in communities and in wildlife populations? what are those viruses? Are they related to known threats, or are they totally new? And so there's a lot of baseline work that needs to happen at that, just on the wildlife side of things, and characterizing those pathogens. And then, the second part of the risk is not just the hazard, but that opportunity, right? An opportunity for exposure. And how do we collect data and information around what species are people coming into contact with, and how exactly are they doing that? And so, we think there's a lot more work that needs to happen on the wildlife side of things, in characterizing those pathogens. And once we do have a catalog of sort of the threat that's out there, what has to happen downstream from, say, an initial PCR detection, right? You want to characterize full genomes, and you want to then ultimately understand, well, does this virus pose a threat to human or other animal health? And that is a very tricky process. Colleagues that we've been working with, including Ralph Barrick, who's one of your people down at UNC, have done a lot of amazing work on that front, and taking viral sequences and then doing the downstream lab work that's needed to say, is this a threat to human health? And particularly with SARS-related coronaviruses, doing sort of viral reconstruction using backbones of other viruses, taking just a sequence of a virus and inserting that into another known virus, doing lab animal experiments to see what is the pathogenicity of those new viruses, looking at cell binding to say, well, can that new virus actually even bind to human cells in the first place? All that lab work is really critical piece of the risk assessment puzzle, in terms of saying, okay, well, we might find 1,000 new viruses, but somehow we have to triage those in terms of the ones that we're going to put a greater investment into our future research on. So I think that's an interesting area of research. The second piece in this editorial with Peter et al. is thinking about surveillance and risk reduction in people at that high risk interface where they have contact with wildlife. And I'll let Hongying speak a little more to that. I think what people don't realize about programs like the USA Predict project is it wasn't just the wildlife viral discovery piece. We actually did a ton of work on the human side of things. We had set up sentinel sites for clinical surveillance in rural communities in these 30 countries around the world. We did community-based surveillance where we went out to communities that are hunting bats or hunting wildlife. We collected blood from them, asked them questionnaires, and screened those samples, not only blood, but oral swabs and other samples, screened those samples for 5 high priority viral families. So there's a lot of work, not only on the wildlife side, but at the human interface. And that's really critical for, those things that once they do slip into the human population, how do you find them early on? And particularly focusing on those high risk communities. I say high risk, meaning those with a lot of animal or wildlife contact, that may be sort of outside of typical surveillance networks. They might not be people that go to hospital, or maybe they just go to rural clinics. And how do you work with some of those rural clinics to spot those early infections? And then the last piece is on improving biosecurity of the wildlife trade and animal markets. Since this pandemic has emerged, there's been calls from a number of wildlife organizations about ending the wildlife trade. And Hongying, this is something she's very passionate about as well. We can, yes, I don't want to see, I don't want to see pangolins getting killed anymore for medicinal value of their scales, more than anyone else. But how do we do that responsibly? If we just pass a law that says we are going to stop the wildlife trade in China, and the Chinese government does that, does that mean it gets pushed underground? Does that mean that the practices are still there, but they're actually less regulated and less safe? So I think it's not a straightforward issue in terms of just banning the trade. I mean, drugs are illegal in most countries and in most places, but drugs are quite available, on most streets around the US. So, I think banning something doesn't mean you solve the problem. And it's the same with wildlife trade. How do we think more holistically about biosafety and biosecurity, and maybe working with those middlemen and those wildlife hunters more directly to create more biosafe practices? And so that was kind of the point we're trying to make with that piece. So I think I'll stop there. I think I went on for my allotment of time, and I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. I'll let Hongying give a quick overview of the other paper and some of the behavioral risk work, and I look forward to chatting with all of you. I'll go on mute now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for this invitation. It's very happy to be here to see everyone. So following on what Kevin said is our work aimed to preventing the pandemic instead of responding to it when it happens. So we go ahead. Our work in China started almost 15 years ago after SARS. So this including identifying bats as a natural reservoir of SARS coronavirus. And we kept working in this rural area, mainly in southern China, because in southern China, which including Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan provinces, we know SARS emerged in Guangdong province. And also these provinces is at the border of China and other Southeast Asian countries. There are a lot very active wildlife trade activities. So we focus on this area, sampling bats and rodents at the very beginning. But after almost like 5 years sampling, screening virals in those wild animals, we find out, okay, now we know kind of enough about how many virals here, but we also saw a lot of people interacting with bats, especially a lot of people in rural communities, they just live next to the bat cave, or there's bats roosting in their houses. So we wonder, okay, since they are contacting with bats so closely, is there any risk? And we want to find out. So we go there. First thing, of course, we do the serological screening of those people, which require a lot, taking the biological samples. In addition, in order to prevent this, we want to understand what would be the risk factors in those communities. So we went to the ground, we did both things. This paper Kevin shared to you is just part of the work, is quantitative. We developed the questionnaire, but before this, we actually did a lot of qualitative interviews, which is more broad. We went to the community, went to the village, went to the wet market in those areas, talking to people. What do they think about the animals? What do they think about the disease risk in this community? So overall, after collecting those data, we screened these biological samples for 4 SARS-related coronavirus, and we find only, I think it's out of 1,500 samples, we only find 9 of them positive, which is a very low rate. But another thing we also did is we asked those people to report some influenza-like or SARS-like symptoms in the past year. Because usually in a rural community, if any spillover event happened, even if people got infected by the virus, those virus may not create or lead to very severe symptoms. So those events won't be caught by the clinical attention. So it may be ignored. So we want them to report those symptoms, and then we connect with their self-report symptoms to their behaviors. So we run the modeling to find out, okay, as showed in this paper, some people, they're eating raw meat, in some rural area, people eating meat like uncooked. And also people living in a certain area are more likely to report those undiagnosed influenza-like symptoms. So this will help us to identify the real high-risk population so we can follow up to find out more. As you can see, the serological positivity is very low. So we're gonna do more longitudinal study to follow up, to do more PCR testing to see how their behavior related to the viral spillover event during a period of time. So actually, this is very interesting result, because when the COVID-19 happened, a lot of people went back to look at this paper to say, okay, see, you already find something there, but what we can do? And we didn't prevent this COVID-19. Why? There's so many reasons, because which is very interesting for me. It's also related to our the paper Kevin just discussed. Although we think people living in the rural community are more likely to contact wild animals, but the type of contact may not be that intensive compared to the human-animal interaction in a certain environment like a wild market. Because both SARS was in Guangzhou, and this time is COVID-19 is in Wuhan. Both cities are big cities. We call the first tile cities in China. So they didn't emerge in rural area. We think they're more wildlife, more contact, but instead they emerge in the wet market in a big city, a city we think should be more safe. So this will lead our future research to focus more on those wildlife market, as Kevin said, the biosafety, biosecurity in the market, to look at both environmental and behavioral risk in those markets. And more research to scale up, and we may not capture the real high risk population, I wondered, but this is something can give us some guidance for our future work. I think that's the work we did in China. And yes, I also, now because this COVID-19, a lot of people, but, and also the government, they have issued a lot of regulation, like banning the wildlife trade. But as Kevin mentioned, banning maybe never worked in China, because they banned the trade for a while after SARS. So, and also the wildlife trade, wildlife farming in China is livelihood for many people in a rural community, because the government, they promote wildlife farming for the poverty reduction. So we need to find a sustainable way, in terms of a healthy way, to regulate the wildlife market to improve the biosafety there. So I will leave the time for questions.
Okay.
And thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great, both of you. That was a really nice introduction to these two papers and give some context. We have some questions coming in. I think I'm going to turn things over to Meredith, because she's a little bit better at navigating all the options. How do you want to handle things, Meredith? Do you want to do questions from the chat, or do you want to ask people to raise their hands and ask questions at this point?
Whichever people prefer. We could certainly start with some of the questions in the chat that have been sent in. It looks like we've got quite a few. I'll just ask one to start off, but y'all as the speakers, feel free to choose questions from the chat box as well. But one question that I'm seeing is, how much has the incidence of spillover changed within the last 2 decades in locations like southern and western China compared with prior decades? So are we seeing a change in the spillover rates?
I can answer that. You know, it's tricky. That analysis is tricky for a number of reasons. We've published in 2017, I think, Allen et al. Is a Nature Communications paper, which was our sort of a revision of our emerging infectious disease hotspot analysis focused on zoonoses. And it's a global analysis. So I think it's, you know, there's not enough data to just say for southern China, you know, how has the number of spillover events changed over the last several decades, at least data that I know about. But at a global level, you can look at these trends and these patterns. And indeed, the number of spillover events or new disease emergence events in the human population has been increasing decade by decade, in fact, year by year. And and I guess, and then we, in that analysis, we look at correlates of that. And so the two important pieces are, I guess, which some of the other questions are getting at, is why, why are those disease events increasing, and what do like human demographics have to do with that? And that, obviously that's a big driver. And then the second piece is research effort, right? Which I think in any analysis you need to correct for. And so in these hotspot analyses, we do it in different ways. In that latest Allen et al. Paper, we came up, which we think was a better way of correcting for the bias, which was actually sort of a sub-national map of disease research effort around the planet by mining open access publications, so PubMed Central papers, pulling out all the location names from all those papers, given a keyword disease ontology, and then using those location names as a base layer for, across tens of thousands of publications in biomedical literature, how much research has been done in different sites around the world. And so when you put that layer into the model, we see that, yes, there's, you're going to find more spillover events where there's more research and more effort, of course. So you always have to tease that out. But then when you control for that, what are the other socioeconomic, demographic, or biological risk factors for new spillovers? And what you see is that human population density is an important driver, of course, globally for these events. And some questions were asking that. And so we know that that's true globally. And obviously that would be true within China, I assume. And then wildlife biodiversity or mammalian biodiversity patterns are another important driver, which gets to that sort of underlying hazard that I was talking about, at understanding the viral richness or the biodiversity in those different species. So where you have more wildlife species, you have more people, and then also where you have other things happening in terms of like land use change. And when we put in covariates for land use change, those also came out as significant. So, things that people have been talking about for emergence for a while, but it's nice to see it coming out in a global analysis where those factors are significant and important at a global level. So I'll stop there because there's a lot of other questions.
Okay, I saw a question about wet markets. Why are wet markets in big city riskier than rural community that living with animals? I would not say it's riskier, but I just say it's interesting to explore. But there's many theories behind this, which is when those animals are hunted in a rural community, they went through middlemen and all the transportation, the long value chains. During this process, usually they put a lot of species, different species mixed together, and then at the market. You must have heard about the pangolin could have carried this SARS-CoV-2, but it's not the direct intermediate host as far as we know now. But it's possible because pangolin are transported from other country to China, or in China mixed with other animals. So pangolin may contract this virus during the transportation. And I think it's something to do with the diversity of species in the market. And also people usually slaughter the animals at the market. If you go to the market, you can see a slaughtering site, or every vendor, they would slaughter the animal by themselves. So that creates more intensive interfaces. And of course, in a big city, once the virus spill over from animal to human, it's a big population, so it can spread faster. So there are many other things to explore. And in the market, there are also other environmental factors driving those spillover probably and the emergence. And yeah, that's our next step. We're going to do a risk assessment in different wet markets in China to look at the facility and the vendors' behavior and the species and the way the vendors sell animals in the market. And also domestic animal. Yes, that's one of the big challenge and limitation in our research. We did find, Kevin also knows, we did find the bat coronavirus infected pigs in China that kill a lot of piglets in China. But in our whole surveillance work, we were not able to sampling domestic animal. This is the one health issue we know, but this requires a lot of collaboration. We collaborate with CDC, human health sectors, local hospital, and also university, conservation forestry. But in terms of working with agriculture department, which is very difficult in our situation in China. So we were not able to, but we're trying to do more, especially in China. In the rural area, in every household, you can see they have a backyard, they have a chicken, dogs, or pigs, and people have reported seeing the wild animal interacting with those domestic animal. So that's definitely something we need to look at to explore. And another question, one more question is the antibody. Yeah, we may miss a lot and missed a lot positive cases because the antibody waned, because we don't know much about other bad coronavirus, but according to SARS, the antibody waned maybe 2 or 3 years. So we may missed a lot in this case.
Great. So it looks like we've had a hand raised for a bit. So let's get to that hand raise. Looks like it's from Itzel Arias del Razo. You are free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for allowing me to ask my question. So I am an ecologist, and currently I'm leading a project in central Mexico, which involves trapping. So we're trapping different species, including bats, rodents, and medium-sized mammals. So right now I'm really concerned because I'm not so sure on whether we should stop or, I mean, at the moment we're not trapping, we are in quarantine. But once the period or the authorities allow us to continue with our work, I'm not so sure if if for biologists, this is a correct thing to do, to go out to the field, to, in my case, to national parks and start trapping animals. Basically, we are just taking some tissue samples because we're looking at gene flow, but I'm super concerned that we can be a way to start a spillover here in Mexico for wildlife. So I would like to know what you think and what's your opinion. I know that you are mainly focused on trade, but I think also biologists are a way that, unfortunately, we are also a way that for these spillovers to occur. Thank you.
That's a great question. And, you know, I think when we think about One Health, often in the media and often in the research, it's usually thought, you know, it's not thought to be by many of us, but most of the public thinks of this as a one-way street, right? Where viruses or other pathogens jump from wildlife to people. But of course, we know that they go both ways. And this idea of spillback, or whatever you want to call it, is a really critical one. And so we have been working, in fact, I'm on a call later today. I've been part of this group from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Geological Survey looking at the risk of SARS-CoV-2 spill back from people to wildlife, particularly thinking about North American bats. And so we're actually putting a risk assessment together that should be public hopefully in a couple weeks. In the meantime, as sort of precautionary principle, they've suggested that people hold off on some of the field work, but people are doing that anyway because people are in isolation, as you said. You know, I think what's going to come out of that is going to be a lot of there will be a technical assessment and an expert opinion assessment of that risk. But in my view, it's a pretty simple solution is wearing, and this has its own issues with availability, but personal protective equipment while you do the work. And we have protocols that I can share with you offline, but if you just Google it, you'll find them from the USAID PREDICT project. There are wildlife sampling protocols for small carnivores, for bats, for rodents, and all of those publicly available protocols include guidance on personal protective equipment. And a lot of those protocols were developed to protect people from exposure to viruses from wildlife, but they're going to have the same efficacy if they're done properly in terms of protecting the bats or the carnivores from getting your viruses. So, I think, yes, I mean, to be super safe, we're holding off on field work right now, and this risk assessments and in process especially for the North American bat work. But I think that, and Mexico is North America, I should acknowledge here. And so, this is a US produced document, but we'll be sure that gets shared widely across networks. But I think wearing at least some kind of basic protection and taking the same precautions you would take to prevent your grandmother from getting sick, with social distancing, et cetera, that will go a long way with protecting wildlife from getting the virus too.
Great, thanks. So going back to the questions in the chat box, it looks like Randy Nessie had asked whether the wet markets are primarily for food or for medicinal purposes. And since that's probably going to be a quick question to answer, also from Randy Kramer, he asked, in the spillover paper, few of the survey respondents reported using risk mitigation practices to prevent disease transmission. And as people have been pointing out in the chat, these spillover events are rare, but as populations increase, there's more people and more human-animal interaction, these rare events are going to become more frequent. So how might risk mitigation measures be encouraged in the future?
I can firstly answer the question about the wet market. I think I would like to see wet markets in China as a transition status between wildlife market and supermarket. Whereas we call it wet market when there's live animal traded there. So it could be you can mostly say domestic animal, of course. You can say chicken, dogs mixed together, but almost every time you can see some bamboo rats or civets hiding in the back of the store. So in terms of behavior changes, we just did a study about the knowledge, attitude, practice in wildlife trade. So firstly, I think according to the results, people have very low awareness about what is zoonotic disease. The very well-known zoonotic disease in China is rabies. Just because the government did a lot of educational campaign on this. So that's one of the suggestions we have. We have to increase the knowledge among the public about the knowledge, about the zoonotic disease, about the risk factors. So that's the first step. But in terms of change behavior, I think there's so many things to think about. If we see this as a health-related behavior, we need to look at how people perceive the risk. How they perceive the risk is one thing. Another thing is the cost to implementing these measures. For example, especially for this high-risk population, the people working in the market slaughtering animal, would they put on gloves or PPE or something? Because if they wear those things, that may slow down their work, which means they lose money. So it's a lot of factors to think about this. First is increasing the knowledge. And also our study also shows after the SARS, people's awareness about the risk of wildlife trade increased. But then with time, we did the survey twice, so between 3 years. So with time, their knowledge about zoonotic disease decreased. So which means increasing knowledge is the very first step towards bringing about behavior changes. That's a practice change perspective about this.
There was a comment on poverty and disease risk, and certainly that socioeconomic status is a big factor. Interestingly, and Hongying, correct me if I'm wrong, but in China, you know, what's happened over the last several decades is that as there's been more wealth and more affluence and the rise of a more wealthy middle class, some of that wildlife consumption has actually gone up. So it's not just the poor people eating, you know, wildlife for protein sources as it is in other parts of the world. It's actually the drive is being driven by more wealth, not by less wealth. So you have the sort of opposite socioeconomic effect where maybe some of the poor people are involved in the hunting and the wildlife trade, but you have the wealthier people driving the demand.
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct. Another research showed people with higher income or even higher education are more likely to consume wildlife. And also another thing is the Chinese government banned the consumption of wildlife, which is only banned edible wildlife, which is a very small part of the whole wildlife trade. In China, it's not only individually hunting wildlife. The big industry of wildlife farming for fur and for Chinese medicine is huge. It's huge, and they're mammals. And you know, the spillover event has something to do with population density. So when they farm those animals like bamboo rats and raccoon dogs and different things in a big farm with a lack of the biosecurity facility, that's a big risk. So that's why we think banning the edible wildlife consumption is like nothing.
Yeah, but both of those comments really underscore the point that Konstantinos, myself, and Emerald have been making in the chat, which is, you know, the demand by wealthier people is what's creating a trade which is putting poor people at risk, and then those poor people become the flashpoint where the epidemic begins. And then, you know, with population density, then you have more people that you can transmit to, and you've got a perfect storm, as one of the chats said.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it is a big and important factor. Absolutely. I think it's an astute point. And I think Konstantinos also said, you know, another issue about successful viruses, right? I'm thinking about evolutionary adaptation. You know, there's a certain amount of stochasticity to spill over, obviously. But there's also those viruses that make it and make the jump and then successfully spread, obviously have different characteristics than those that don't. So, you know, the elements of contact and initial infection, there's some stochasticity around, but obviously successful infection is going to favor those viruses that are more adapted to that. And that's part of what I was talking about with like Ralph Barrick's work, right? We've found hundreds of strains of bat coronaviruses in China. We have a paper that hopefully should be out in a week or two. But of those hundreds of strains, not all of them are going to have that same probability, right, of jumping.
Great. So we've got time for probably a couple more questions. Does anyone want to ask a question before I jump back to the chat box? You can use the raise hand function if so. Give that a second. Okay, well, feel free to raise your hand if you think of something, but I'll go back to the chat box for now. So from R. Brooks Roby, had a question about the specificity of spillover within the wet markets. Wondering if the people who gather the animals in the wild are the same as the ones processing and selling these in the marketplace, and essentially are there differential risks for vendors versus customers, and where proximity and duration of exposure is going to be different. Do we have any information on that?
Hongying, you want me to start? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's differential risk. The amount of data we have is sort of pieced together by different lines of evidence. We know from the animal sampling that different groups of viruses are found in different sample types. So some viruses are found in saliva samples, and just say we're sampling a bat. Some viruses will be found in the saliva, some will be found in the urine, some in the feces, some in the blood. So what activity you're doing and what fluid you're coming into contact with is going to determine your risk. And for coronaviruses, these are more enteric pathogens for the bats, as far as we can tell. They're excreted in the feces primarily. Occasionally they're found in saliva samples, but mostly they're found in the fecal samples. So it's more like a fecal oral route of transmission, likely if a person were to get this virus from a bat. So that would suggest higher risk for the wildlife hunters, those people that are handling live animals, or if there's live animals in the market coming into contact with feces and urine from the live animals. Whereas butchering, at least for that group of viruses, and coming into contact with blood is probably a lower risk. And even still lower if you're a consumer and you're cooking that meat before you eat it, right? That's even a lower risk. So yeah, it gets back to the sort of natural routes of transmission for the viruses, and of course duration of exposure is important too. So if you're a market vendor and you're sitting there all day long, butchering, you say 20 civet cats a day, then your risk is going to be a lot greater than the one person who takes home a civet in a bag, every 2 weeks or something. So, not to be too graphic, but it is pretty graphic.
All right, so I think got one more question. So from Benjamin Auerbach, given this perfect storm, the solution appears to be a mix of education, providing alternative forms of income, and a kind of constant surveillance using sentinel species. But how would this policy be implemented? And then Emily Willock also commented kind of in a similar vein, are there any cultural connections we can use in conjunction with education to help reduce risk?
Go ahead, Hongying.
I think it's a very good question. I think it's very hard to this policy to implement in China, considering the very confusing regulation system in China about the wildlife. What is wildlife? What is domestic animal? Who is doing the surveillance? Which is also can answer related to a previous question about is the animal in a community in a rural area can be used to detect the spillover. Yes, in China, the agriculture department, the forestry department, they're in charge of wild animal and domestic animal. And also if those animals go to the market, it's going to do with the market regulation department. And for all the wildlife animal, there's no quarantine regulation, which means no one gonna check their disease. But there's like a surveillance disease wildlife epidemic surveillance station in China at every conservation station, but the reporting system is very poor, and there's only 2 people in charge of the office, the whole system. So it's very hard. It's a one health issue, so it needs a one health approach to deal with it. And also in China, people only pay attention to those wildlife who are on the list of protected wildlife in China, which means bats, all the bats, no any bat species is protected in China. So they're not protected, they're not regulated, so no one cares if they are being hunted or different things. So there's so much different perspective we need to work on. Currently, EcoHealth Alliance is working with some policy scholars in China to review those policies in China, because Chinese government is going to amend those lists, including the list of the protected wildlife and the list of, we call 3 value wildlife, because they saw wildlife as a valuable natural resources, and also the list of livestock and poultry genetic resources of different animals. This will this matter a lot because once the species can be put on the list, that means no matter which department, they're going to pay attention to these animals, and they may implement sort of a quarantine on it in terms of farming and market trading. So it's very hard to implement. And for the education, I think China, they already have a good example as rabies. It's a massive education campaign in the rural community about rabies. Everyone knows they need to get the vaccine. Everyone knows to report to the doctor. So it could be easy if the government want to do something to integrate those messages in the rabies campaign in China to educate the public about this.
Anything to add, Kevin? Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that was great. I think leveraging those existing, you know, where we have diseases that have been well managed, you know, how do we tap into those mechanisms, as Hongying just said, maybe with rabies surveillance, I think is a good path forward for some of the mitigation.
Okay, everyone, we're at the end of the discussion at the top of the hour. I want to thank Hongying and Kevin again for providing us with a great set of papers to read. I know I'm going to be using these in my teaching, actually, both of these papers. They're really fantastic. And thank you guys for taking the time. I want to also thank Meredith Spence-Bolio. I forgot to introduce you properly, Meredith, our Assistant Director at TRISEM, for organizing all of this, and all of our other partners and the members of the committee who've been a part of developing our program. And with that in mind, I want to point out that we have another one of these next Tuesday. It will be Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, US Eastern Time. We have Vaughn Cooper, who's going to be talking about, I'm getting the title here, Ongoing Evolution of SARS-CoV-2, an Evolutionary Medicine Challenge for Research and Teaching. So for some of you interested in bringing this into the classroom, I think you're going to enjoy that, or just in terms of public outreach. And he has 2 YouTube videos. We've shared those links, and I think you're going to want to watch those before you come, and we'll have, I think, a very productive conversation. So thank you all for joining. This has been, I think, another fantastic conversation, and we will put the recording up and share it with you, and you'll be able to watch any parts you missed or see the full text of the chat. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith and Charlie. It was great to be here. Thanks everybody for showing up.
Thank you, everyone.
Excellent.